Hello and welcome to my presentation on argument configurationality and discourse configurationality in Old Icelandic. Configurationality as a property of language has attracted quite a lot of attention since the early work by the likes of Hale. And now we can distinguish between two types of configurationality, which I'll be talking about today. The first one is argument configurationality, or AC. And that has to do with to what extent specific grammatical functions are associated with particular C structure positions. And we can distinguish that from the second type, discourse configurationality, or DC, namely to what extent specific discourse functions are associated with particular C structure positions. Now, many of the contributions on configurationality focus on either AC or DC, and there's little general consensus on the relationship between the two types. So some view AC and DC as alternatives spanning one typological dimension, but there's some empirical evidence to suggest that AC and DC are somewhat independent. So on the one hand, we have languages which are not argument configurational, but show DC. We also have languages which exhibit neither AC nor DC, and languages which exhibit some level of both types. So it seems that we need more research which considers the two types together. And today I'll be discussing AC and DC with respect to Old Icelandic. And Old Icelandic provides an interesting case study for this for two reasons. So first of all, Old Norse Icelandic has been previously claimed to be non-argument configurational, and that's a claim by Forlan 1990. And the second reason why Old Icelandic is interesting for this topic is that there's a lot of recent work on early Germanic indicating that information structure, IS, drives word order. And actually, some have even claimed some varieties are discourse configurational. So that's been claimed, for example, by for early English and for Old High German. So I'm looking at AC and DC in Old Icelandic today from the perspective of LFG. And I'll show that the flexibility of C structure allows for a more nuanced approach to the data than what has been proposed before, and specifically because Old Icelandic indicates a mixture of endocentricity and lexocentricity. The parallel architecture is also well suited for capturing AC and DC independently, because we can capture AC in terms of the correspondence between C structure positions and GF, so F structure. And we can capture DC in terms of the correspondence between C structure positions and IS attributes at I structure. And I'll be assuming this separate level of representation for information structure, I structure, along the lines of that proposed by Butt and King. My data comes from two corpora of Old Icelandic. I'm using IcePack, specifically the Old Icelandic section of that corpus, which is Penstel Treebank. And I'm getting additional data from MicePack, which is kind of extension of IcePack, specifically looking at the Old Icelandic saga texts, which is currently under development. And on the basis of the corpus data, I make three claims about Old Icelandic. The first is that at C structure, we have an endocentric functional projection and a lexocentric S. So that's that mixture of endocentricity and lexocentricity that I was talking about. And specifically, we have no evidence for there being a VP constituent. Then I look at argument configurationality, and I claim that Old Icelandic is indeed non-argument configurational. That is, grammatical functions are not associated with specific C structure positions. And then the third claim is that Old Icelandic does exhibit some DC. Specifically, we have a C structure position in the midfield, which is exclusively associated with topics. And this is interesting because the midfield really has been neglected in Germanic verb second languages, because a lot of the attention in terms of information structural work has been on the prefield, what's going on in that prefield position. So we're going to have a closer look at the neglected midfield later on. Okay, so first let's look a little bit at the original claim by Forland. And he provides some very broad evidence for the non-argument configurationality claim, namely the lack of a VP constituent, the fact that Old Icelandic exhibits null arguments, the fact we have an absence of expletives, as well as discontinuous noun phrases and prepositional phrases, albeit rare examples of those. And this very broad evidence for the non-configurationality claim is in line with the early work on non-configurationality. And we'll be taking a narrower view of this today. Now, the criticism of Forland's claim, specifically by Platzak and Runvaldsen, had two motivations, really. And they're two motivations which actually don't stand up so well today. So first off, the criticism was motivated by this general trend at the time in certain generative approaches towards the view that all languages are underlyingly argument configurational, regardless of what's going on in terms of surface word order. Right, so off the back of this, Forland's non-configurationality claim was essentially dismissed on theory internal grounds, on the basis that in this view, you just can't have a non-configurational language. The second motivation for the criticism was a diachronic one, and this is specifically Runvaldsen, who argues that, well, if Old Icelandic is non-configurational, then we've got to have a radical change to configurationality by modern Icelandic. And Runvaldsen argued that this just wasn't possible, this kind of dramatic change. So the claim was dismissed on diachronic grounds. But we should say that this diachronic motivation is really based on an all or nothing view of configurationality, right? You're either configurational or you're not. So that's the story behind the claim and the criticism. And I think it seems reasonable to revisit Forland's original claim now from the perspective of LFG. Now, LFG still allows for shades of non-configurationality, and we can view it as a spectrum, as has been previously suggested. And as I've mentioned already, non-configurationality or configurationality is determined on the basis of a narrower set of criteria. Secondly, recent diachronic studies have shown that the gradual growth of structure and with it a shift towards increased configurationality is possible. And indeed, this has been evidence for North Germanic. So this is heading away from a black and white view of configurationality and actually seeing that you can have a gradual shift over time. And that's been claimed by Boyas et al. For the noun phrase in North Germanic, and by myself and colleagues for the clause in North Germanic. So some good reasons, I think, to revisit this claim now. Now, before examining how grammatical functions map to C structure positions, we have to be clear what those positions actually are. So next I'm going to have a look at how the C structure of Old Icelandic is organised. So we have some evidence for endocentricity at clause level, as I've shown together with Christine Schätzler before. And we've claimed that in Old Icelandic you already have an obligatory functional IP projection headed by the finite verb in I. And the finite verb, the motivation for this endocentricity is this second position phenomenon, namely that you've got a finite verb which is positionally restricted. We have mostly verb second in Old Icelandic and some verb first. But we analyse verb first in terms of this IP structure. Now the pre-field in this structure, spec IP, is IS privileged, but I'm going to say more on that a bit later on. So we've got some endocentricity at clause level, but as I show today, we've also got evidence for lexocentricity, specifically in terms of the word order freedom that's going on in the midfield. And I go with Forland's original claim, namely that there's no evidence for there being a VP constituent in Old Icelandic. Now, Forland's original observations for this claim are supported by my corpus data. So we have an absence of VP pronominalization, VP fronting, and VP clefting. In other words, the verb and its object fail these classic constituency tests. So that part of the evidence is confirmed, but we should say that this type of evidence, specifically negative evidence, right, the absence of structures in historical attestation, is notoriously problematic, right? We don't really like this kind of evidence to stand up on its own in historical linguistics. So I think it's indeed sensible to look instead for positive evidence to support this claim, right? The fact that there's no VP constituent. So that's what I do now. And we do indeed find positive evidence for this. So firstly, the relative order of the non-finite verb in the midfield and its object is flexible. And this is well known for Old Icelandic, and I've given some examples here. So in 1, we've got both orders attested with objects which are full noun phrases. And in 2, we've also got both orders attested, this time with objects which are pronominal. So we've got flexibility in the relative order. And the corpus data indeed confirms that both are robustly attested in Old Icelandic. There is a preference for the VO order, but still there's a lot of examples of OV as well. Now previously this flexibility, this OV-VO flexibility, has been captured in terms of endocentricity. So Rönnvoldsen proposes that we've got a VP constituent whose head parameter is unspecified. And Hroarsdottir says we've got underlyingly a left-headed VP with extensive movement to account for OV orders. So both analyse it in terms of having a VP constituent which is endocentric. But we don't need to resort to endocentricity in LFG, right? We can capture this flexibility in terms of a lexocentric S, which is the complement of I, as shown in the structure here. And we can assume that the order here underneath I of the verb and its object is flexible. So that's the first observation in support of there being no VP constituent. The second observation is that we don't get VP fronting, as we said before, but you do get cases where single elements from the verbal complex can occur in the prefield. And this is really stylistic fronting, as described for modern Icelandic before by Mailing. So in 3A, we have a past participle in the prefield. In 3B, we have an infinitive. And in 3C, we have a verbal particle. So you can't put a whole VP there, a verb and its object, but you can put single elements. Given that the prefield typically hosts constituents, this would be further evidence against a VP constituent. The third positive piece of evidence concerns what can intervene between a non-finite verb and its object. And in modern Icelandic, a sentence adverb cannot intervene between the verb and its object in the midfield, as we see in 5. Having sjaldan here between the verb and its object is ungrammatical. And this has been taken as evidence for there being a VP constituent in modern Icelandic. Now, when we look at Old Icelandic, we actually find that a sentence adverb can intervene, right? So we do get lots of instances of this structure here. And I've given you some examples here, and each time the adverb is in bold. So sentence adverbs can intervene in this way. Note that this is not just reserved for orders where the verb is before its object. You also get the configuration shown here in 7. Object, adverb, verb. And again, your adverbs are in bold there. Tempo-spatial adverbs also show interesting behaviour. So in modern Icelandic, these occur after the VP and cannot precede the VP in the midfield, as Thrawnson has shown. So we get the structure in 8, which is grammatical, with sentence final tempo-spatial adverb here. But this configuration, where you have it before the verb and its object, is ungrammatical. Now in Old Icelandic, again, we find a different picture. These tempo-spatial adverbs can actually commonly intervene between the verb and object in the midfield. And we've got some examples here. Now, strikingly, there's also instances where a subject can intervene between the verb and the object. And this would, of course, be further evidence that there's no VP constituent. And I've given you examples here where the subject is shown in bold. Now, you might notice that all of these examples involve a quantified subject in some way, and I'll return to this in a bit. Importantly, I did a check in the IcePack data for modern Icelandic, and this order where you have a subject intervening in this way is not attested. So it seems to be an Old Icelandic thing, or an earlier Icelandic thing. Okay, so we can capture this lexocentricity in the midfield in this way. So we're still sticking with this S that I've mentioned before, under which the order is relatively free. And we'll say more on the precise ordering in a bit. Okay, so now we've sorted out C structure organization, we can think about to what extent Old Icelandic is argument configurational. Now, as I've shown, there's a lot of evidence for there being no VP. So subjects and objects can be sisters under this S. And under this S, the subject, object and verb do indeed exhibit some flexibility in terms of order. Moreover, both subjects and objects can occur in spec IP, up here, provided they're under the right information structural conditions. And we'll come back to that shortly. So what we seem to see here then is that neither subj nor obj are exclusively associated with a particular structural position. So it does seem we can say that Old Icelandic exhibits non-configurationality with respect to arguments. Okay, so the third thing that we need to look at is what is the status of Old Icelandic with respect to discourse configurationality, DC. Specifically, is there any C structure position which can be shown to exclusively map to a particular discourse function? As I've mentioned, I'm assuming a separate level for representation of I information structure, that is I structure. And I'm navigating the notorious minefield of IS terminology in terms of a four-way division shown here in the table. I won't have too much to say about completive information and background information today, and we'll mostly be talking about focus and topic. Okay, so let's look at spec IP first to see if we've got any evidence of DC there. So in a Germanic verb second language, there's typically a close relationship between the prefield and topicality, and the prefield is spec IP in our terms. And it's indeed been claimed for Old Icelandic that this prefield position typically hosts topical constituents. And this is in line with IS accounts for early Germanic, where it is assumed that the finite verb serves as a boundary between topic and comment, as shown in the configuration here. So we can ask, well, do we have evidence that the prefield, spec IP, is really an exclusive topic position? Because that would be evidence for DC. Well, crucially, no, because when we look closely at the data, we find that non-topical constituents can also occur in spec IP. So firstly, you can get in presentational sentences, you can get subjects in spec IP, in the prefield, and subjects of presentational sentences cannot be topics. So here we have a presentational, bear is there also in that land, where our subject is in the prefield. And I've given you a bit more context for the second one. Then King Olafur went out to Stocksund and didn't manage to get out there. Here comes the presentational. Castle is to the west of the strait. A presentational with the subject, the newly introduced subject in the prefield. Some more examples here. These are very common naming constructions which you get in the sagas in particular, and you get the subject in the clause initial position, which cannot be a topic. So we can get subjects of presentational sentences. We can also get contrastive focus elements in spec IP in Old Icelandic. In 15, I've summarised the topic of the previous discourse, which is talking about some other woman. And then we introduce another woman, namely Halldóra, in the sentence here. Halldóra was called a woman. And I argue here that Halldóra is in contrastive focus compared to what's come before. Contrastive focus in the prefield. Similar example in 16. In the previous discourse, we're talking about King Harold and an earl. And then we get Friðrika was called that man who carried the banner. And again, I argue that Friðrika here is in contrastive focus. A more explicit example of contrastive focus in spec IP is given here. So we have a sentence, then we hallow to God a temple in our hearts. And then we get, to 9 angels we hallow a temple. So 9 angels here seems to be in contrastive focus. Okay, so spec IP can host topics, as previously claimed, but I've also shown it can host focus, right? Either the subjects of presentational sentences or specifically contrastive focus. And I'm not going to go into the different types of focus today. So spec IP isn't exclusively associated with the discourse function, therefore there's no evidence for DC here. But there is evidence for discourse configurationality in the midfield. And this is the part of the clause, if you like, that hasn't attracted so much attention in the literature on Germanic verb second. Now, I argue that there's a position which is exclusively associated with topic, which occurs here before the canonical position for adverbs, specifically discourse adverbs. So what's the evidence for this? Well, in presentational sentences with a midfield subject, that is a non-topic, right? Because your subject of a presentational can't be a topic. So in sentences where you've got one of these subjects in the midfield as well as a discourse adverb, like now, so, there, or then, the subject always follows the adverb in the data. And there's plentiful of examples like this. So in other words, you always have the configuration shown here. And I've given you the subject in bold in each. By contrast, we don't find attested examples where the subject, non-topical subject, occurs before an adverb in the midfield, right? And I know this is negative evidence, and we said that that's not good, but that's all, unfortunately, we have to go on here. But crucially, we have the positive evidence as well. Now, the second piece of evidence is similar, and here we're looking at sentences which have got a quantified argument and a discourse adverb in the midfield. And quantified arguments, like presentational subjects, are non-topical. And here we find that the non-topic quantified argument always follows the adverb as well. In other words, we have the configuration in 20. And there's some examples with the quantified argument in bold. Now, this can now account for those earlier examples we saw where we had a subject intervening between the object and the verb in the midfield, because we were dealing with a quantified subject each time. And if we look more closely at the object, which occurs before it, we find that in each case it is a topic. Now, further evidence that we've got this pre-adverbial position in the midfield, which is exclusively associated with topic, is the fact that these discourse adverbs do appear to act as an information structural boundary between topic and non-topical material afterwards. And here, again, we've got some examples. I'm showing the discourse adverb in each case in bold, which we take to be this information structural boundary. And I should say that this isn't just an effect of pronominal or definite marked arguments, which have to be before this boundary, because these can actually occur later if they can be construed as non-topical. So we've got examples in 23 here, where the argument is shown in bold in each case. And it's a non-topic, and it occurs after a discourse adverb. Okay, so I think we've got some evidence here that Old Icelandic does exhibit some level of discourse configurationality. Namely that we have this designated topic position in the midfield, which I represent here. And this is interesting because it has actually been suggested for modern German by Frey that modern German has a topic position, an exclusive topic position in the midfield as well. And he therefore claims that modern German is to some extent discourse configurational. So I think looking at what's going on in the midfield in Germanic V2 languages in terms of information structure is a worthwhile pursuit. Okay, so to summarise, I've shown that Old Icelandic C structure exhibits a mixture of endocentricity and lexocentricity, in that we had this combination where we had a functional projection, RIP, with the head I taking an S complement. And this combination of endocentricity and lexocentricity seems to be quite common, namely that there's various languages where we have some second position phenomenon, and then after this second position, post-second, we've got quite a lot of word order freedom. And this is indeed what we find for some of the classic poster children of non-configurationality, right? The likes of Woolbury and Wambaya. They all exhibit some type of this combination. With respect to argument configurationality, I've shown that there's little evidence for it in Old Icelandic. So the next logical question is, well, what does identify grammatical relations in Old Icelandic if it's not position? It's likely to be a complex interaction between case and lexical semantics. Christine Schätzler has done some work on that, but it's probably something that should be pursued further. Finally, I've shown that there is some evidence for discourse configurationality, but crucially that this is not in reference to the pre-field, which has attracted most interest to date, but actually concerns the midfield, where we have this designated topic position. And I think it would be nice to do some more research on the relation between C structure and I structure in early Germanic, particularly looking at this midfield area. But for that, unfortunately, we need probably some more information structurally annotated data, which is very time costly. But that's perhaps something to think about for the future. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.